used one form of money, by definition that money would have to account for all the value in the world. It sounds funny, but it's just the logical equivalent of saying, if you only use one tool to measure X, it must measure X. And if you only had one form of money to hold all of the value, then it must hold all of the value. But there's not only one tool to measure value, there's many. Each country has its own, roughly speaking, and they're all divisible by different amounts. In the same way that meter-long rulers are divisible into 100 centimeters, and foot-long rulers are divisible into 12 inches, the United States dollar is divisible into trillions of dollars, etc. So instead of thinking of these individual currency units, the dollar or £1, as independent instances of that form of money, be it the pound or the dollar or whatnot, instead, consider the entirety of all units as the single instance of that form of money, and it has a size equal to the total value that it accounts for. Now you can think of the individual units of that currency as markers along the way, sort of like inch markings along a foot-long ruler, or centimeter markings along a meter ruler. Now there are many different forms of money, and they all have very different sizes, and they're all competing for the same value, in a sense, with the United States dollar currently being far in the lead. Side note, by the way, this makes it way easier to understand how silly inflation is. Adding more markers to a meter-long ruler won't make the ruler any longer just because you said that they were centimeters. Because, well, they're not. This is where the whole term fiat money comes from. Fiat means by decree, or in other words, because I said so. The issuers of additional units of money, or the money printers, or even more accurately, the money dividers, since they're dividing the total into smaller pieces, they say by decree that the additional divisions are just the same size as the old ones that were there before they started adding more marks. And they say that this is the case because they said so. This is what makes fiat money fiat. It's valuable because someone said so, rather than something like gold or Bitcoin or many commodities which have organic demand. People just want it. You don't have to try and tell them that they do, which I'm getting sidetracked again. But as the US dollar depegged from gold, this was a massive effort of the United States government to try and convince everybody, including other countries who were confident that their dollars had value because they were tied up in gold, that they didn't really want the gold. What they actually wanted was the small pieces of paper. It was a genuine effort. They had to try and just say by decree, you like these pieces of paper, don't you? Now we're keeping your gold. Anyway, tangent over. As these various forms of money that we were talking about earlier grow in size, they account for larger and larger portions of global value, and they've all been at it for quite some time now. Bitcoin, however, has existed for much less time and has had much less time to grow. So how much value does the entirety of Bitcoin account for today? Well, about $790 billion. For some comparison, because big numbers mean nothing to me either, global GDP, the yearly value production of the world in 2021, was roughly $96 trillion. This is total Bitcoin value, stood next to the value produced in 2021 alone. When you put Bitcoin in the context of its price history, of course, it looks huge. Just as when you compare the size of a human to the single cell that they began as, they're huge as well. But that's the thing, to come into existence, they had to start at zero. Zero is the entry door from the non-existent to the existent. You wouldn't call a baby tall, even though they've grown a million times taller than they once were. And much like a baby, Bitcoin has also grown exponentially. But when you put Bitcoin on the stage that it's set to play in, it's quite literally the size of an ant. Anyway, I think the question... This damn wobbly plant. I think the question, how big can Bitcoin get, essentially just comes down to framing. If you see Bitcoin as a tech startup that's gone from zero to £24,000 in 14 years, you're probably going to believe that Bitcoin is huge, and that you've missed the boat. But if you see it as a new competitive form of global money, well, then you're just about as early as it gets. And if you know anything about Bitcoin at all, you'll know that the former makes absolutely no sense. But you can make a very strong case for the latter. And just to get this straight, Bitcoin is not a tech startup. It's not a legal entity. It has no CEO. It pays no dividends. And there's nobody on Earth who could single-handedly screw it up. This is never the case for startups. Bitcoin may be a new competitive form of global money. I mean, at the end of the day, it is the properties of money, given life through code, and it's showing no signs of failure. So, I guess, yeah, in summary, just take another look at the size comparison, and you should get a slightly better idea of roughly how big Bitcoin actually is, with some context that actually fits the picture. Anyway,